The, the pre-platinum jubilee CME has generated a lot of interest, not only in our state, not only in the country, also we have participation from outside the country. Since we conceptualized and started the program on 1st July, the auspicious National Doctors' Day, there has been tremendous response. We get information from many of the alumni outside the state and outside the country that we have not been able to communicate them about the program. And that's the reason we had a drive to communicate as many as we can. There has been a lot of interest, enthusiasm for the Platinum Jubilee and SCBN Global Conclave. The preparation is going on in full swing. And as all of you know, that we have got a 3-page celebration of the program. And we are in the first page. Today is the 24th department out of the 37 department we have. Each department has done their best to present a very interesting area or topic or clinical discussion, which is really giving information enormous to each one of us. And these are all useful in our clinical practice or in our activity, day-to-day activity that we have in our clinical practice. Today also we have a very wonderful program. As regard the microbiology department is concerned, healthcare personnel are very vital. We are vulnerable people because we are exposed to the environment of infection and so on and so forth. And when we say that healthcare personnel, you are all aware in the present COVID pandemic, we are in the forefront. In fact, we are the COVID warrior. Others are there. They are also declared as COVID warrior. But definitely, the amount of exposure and risk that we undergo through our process of treatment for the patient who are COVID positive, we are very vulnerable. A lot of our fellow colleagues in the hospital, in the SCB itself also has become COVID positive. We have lost one friend, a very dear friend of ours because of this COVID infection. So how we can prevent, how we can safeguard ourselves from infection, and particularly in the present scenario of the COVID infection. We were passing through a phase of COVID. Now suddenly there is an upsurge of dengue. Now, now there are multiple challenges when we look at the infection that is being contracted by a healthcare personnel. Today we have two eminent speakers, one from our own institute, Dr. Shami Patra, and the other one, Dr. Apurva Sankar Sastri, who is the additional professor in JIPMER, Puducherry. I welcome you, both the speakers, along with all the participants. Now we are in the first phase that I mentioned. We are going into the second phase from 13th September. I am given to understand that all departments are preparing themselves for the second phase of the celebration, and they have been doing their best to project their department. And as I have already mentioned in my letter, that we have got three aspects that we will be projecting each department wise. Now the past, the present, and the future. Now the past, all the past faculty will be felicitated. The present department will mention about their present working situation and what are the achievements, what are the contributions they have made, and for the future, what vision they have for the department as we proceed towards the centenary. Now the final program, there is the third and the final from 26th of November. We have already contacted many luminaries from all across the country and outside, from different field of their specialty. They will be participating, and I believe we will definitely make it a grand success with the help and support of all. Now I welcome you all again, and definitely today the topic is so interesting. It will definitely benefit all of us. With these few words, I hand over to our revered Professor Chaini, who is there in the in the office of our telemedicine. Now, she will take over and moderate with one request that let's confine the talk to 20 minutes and 2 talks will be completed. Anybody has any questions, please put in your chat box. The moderator will take care of it. Thank you and hand over to Professor Chaini.
Thank you, sir. Good afternoon, everybody. On behalf of the Department of Microbiology, I, Professor Dr. Neetu Kumar Chaini, would extend my heartiest welcome to our most beloved Dean and Principal, Professor Dr. Sarsuta, and Professor Dr. Apurva Sastry from JIPMER, and all the faculty members of SCB Medical College and their postgraduate students to attend this pre-platinum jubilee series. Today, the topic of discussion is healthcare associated infection. For that, there are 2 speakers. One is one SCBian, Dr. Soumi Patra, and another one is the eminent Professor Dr. Apurva Sastry, the additional professors of JIPMER, Puducherry. Dr. Soumi Patra is currently working as assistant professor in the Department of Microbiology. She is a very young, dynamic lady. She got first prize in Best Paper Award in IIMM Odisha chapter, and she completed her MD Microbiology in our department. After that, completed the tutorships and worked as research scientist in BRDL. She took a training on hospital infection control program in Hyderabad and also the diagnostic methods in clinical microbiology from JIPMER. Now she is working as the co-investigator for BMR study conducted in JIPMER. So I welcome Dr. Soumi to give her first lecture on hospital acquired infection. So over to Dr. Soumi. Please carry on your topic.
Thank you very much, madam, for your kind introduction. I'm extremely honored to represent myself as an SCBian while I am still working at SCB in the Department of Microbiology. I have been assigned a topic, overview of healthcare associated infections. Now, previously, such type of infections were called nosocomial infections or hospital acquired infections. The term nosocomial has been derived from 2 Greek words. Nosos means disease and comial means to take care of. However, CDC Atlanta recommends to use healthcare associated infection as a more accepted terminology because it represents all types of healthcare facilities, like it may be any hospital or nursing homes or OPD clinics, etc. HIs are defined as infections acquired by patient admitted for a reason other than the infection in context. It should not be present or incubating at the time of admission, and the symptoms should appear at least after 48 hours of admission. It includes also the infections which have been acquired in the hospital, but the symptoms may appear after discharge. It includes the occupational infections among the staff and also the neonatal infections that occurs while passes through the birth canal. The classical epidemiological triad shows that any infection is caused by interaction of host, agent, and environment. However, more specifically, if we can see that any infection is caused when the infectious agent leaves its reservoir host via a portal of exit and is transmitted through an appropriate portal of entry to affect the susceptible or vulnerable host. And to prevent HAIs, we have to break this chain of infection. There are 2 main sources of infection. It may be either exogenous, where the organisms are present outside the body, or endogenous, where the normal human flora plays an important role. Most of the HIs are endogenous in origin. Here the patients admitted were either priorly colonized with such type of organisms or became colonized at some point during the stay after admission. However, we cannot differentiate between these two factors. That's why the term autogenous infection is used to indicate the infections derived from the flora of the patient. This is a picture showing the different exogenous sources. Here you can see the bacteria may come from other patients or from visitors or hospital personnel, or there may be contamination from equipment, or ventilation ducts or elevator shaft may also act as a reservoir. Now, any microorganisms like any viruses, bacteria, fungi or parasites have a potential to cause nosocomial infection. But the vast majority of HAIs are caused by the escape pathogens. This acronym has been given by the Infectious Disease Society of America. Why escape pathogen? Because they escape the biocidal action of antibiotics and they show a new pattern of resistance. The pathogens are Enterococcus faecium, Staphylococcus aureus, Klebsiella pneumoniae, Acinetobacter baumannii, Pseudomonas aeruginosa, Enterobacter species. Now the list has been expanded to escapes. One more S is added to denote that Stenotrophomonas mitophilia. And in Indian settings, E. coli is another important MDR pathogen. Now, HIs can be transmitted through different modes, either by contact, inhalation, or common vehicle like food, water devices, or vector-borne, which is very rare. The most common mode is the contact. It may be either through direct contact, which is the most important and frequent mode of transmission, but the hands of healthcare personnel plays an important role. Coming to inhalational mode, it can be transmitted either via droplets or airborne, depending on the size of the droplet nuclei. Now, any infection which occurs in a patient after 48 hours of admission can be called as healthcare associated infection. But the most common types are catheter associated UTI, catheter related bloodstream infection, ventilator associated pneumonia, surgical site infection. The first three are grouped under device associated infections. Coming to the first HAI, that is catheter associated UTI, which is also the most common type of HAI. Defined as significant bacteriuria in a catheterized patient having signs and symptoms. And when the signs and symptoms are absent, it is called catheter associated asymptomatic bacteriuria. The risk of bacteriuria increases with time. Here we can see that the risk is around 3 to 10% per catheter day. Then gradually it increases to 25% at the end of week, and it reaches to almost 100% in 1 month. And only a fraction, that is less than a quarter of these cases, progresses to catheter associated UTI. The infective organism may ascend the urinary tract either via extraluminal surface of the catheter, which is seen in 2/3 of the cases, or via intraluminal surface seen in 1/3 of the cases. In short-term catheterized patient, the bacteriuria is mostly monomicrobial, and the predominant pathogen is E. coli, followed by other Enterobacteriaceae like Klebsiella, Citrobacter, Enterobacter, non-fermenters like Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter, gram-positive organisms like Coagulus negative Staphylococci, Enterococcus, and funguria is seen in 3 to 30% of the cases. And among fungus, the Candida is the most important pathogen, but its clinical significance is not yet known. In long-term catheterized patients, the bacteriuria is mostly polymicrobial, and along with the above pathogens, Proteus, Providencia, Morganella are also encountered. And diagnosis of catheter-associated UTI is based on clinical criteria like the presence of signs and symptoms like new onset or worsening of fever, flank pain, costovertebral angle tenderness, rigors, pelvic discomfort. In spinal cord injury patients, along with the above signs and symptoms, increased spasticity or autonomic dysplasia may be also be seen. And in patients in whom the catheter is removed within 48 hours, dysuria, urgency, frequency are the symptoms. The patient must be catheterized for more than 48 hours. And in short-term catheterized patients, we can go for sampling through catheter port, or we can puncture the catheter tube using a sterile needle. And in long-term catheterized patient, it is always wise to collect the sample from a freshly replaced new catheter. In non-catheterized patients, a clean catch voided urine is sufficient. The third criteria that there must be significant bacteriuria. In symptomatic patients, the colony count should be more than equal to 10 to the power 3, and in asymptomatic patients, it should be more than equal to 10 to the power 5 colony forming unit per ml. Next, the second HAI is the bloodstream infection. Here we can see there are two terms. One is CRBSI, that is catheter-related bloodstream infection. Another term is CLABSI, that is central line associated bloodstream infection. These two terms are different and cannot be interchangeable. The CRBSI term is used for clinical diagnosis and treatment, whereas the term CLABSI is used only for surveillance purpose. Once CRBSI is diagnosed, the device removal is indicated, the clinical criteria in the patient must be present, catheter must be in place, and it is highly sensitive, showing better positive predictive value. Whereas once CLABSI is detected, the device removal is not always indicated, clinical criteria must not be present always, the central line must be present for more than 2 calendar days, and it may actually overestimate the true incidence of bloodstream infection. This is a picture showing how the catheter can be colonized. The most important one is migration of the patient's own skin flora along the surface of the catheter, followed by direct contamination of the catheter or its herb through the hands of the healthcare workers. Gram-positive pathogens are responsible for most of the bloodstream infections, followed by the gram-negative. And among the gram-positive, coagulase-negative staphylococcus is encountered in 31% cases, followed by Staphylococcus aureus in 20%. And among gram-negative, Pseudomonas aeruginosa is the most common pathogen. Approximately less than 3% of all hospitalized patients require central line during their stay, out of which 3 to 8% of the patients develop CLABSI. The CLABSI rate, according to the CDC NHSN data, that means your National Healthcare Safety Network data of USA, shows that the CLABSI rate is around 0 to 2.9% in critical care and 0 to 1.2% in inpatient wards. In India, there is no national data, but some unicentric and multicentric studies have shown that the CLABSI rate is around 2.4 to 5.1 per 1,000 central line days. Here, this is the study showing the same. The diagnosis of CRBSI is based on clinical criteria and microbiological criteria. In clinical criteria, the signs and symptoms pertaining to catheter site infection must be present. And for microbiological criteria, any one of the three must be present. Positive result of semi-quantitative or quantitative catheter segment culture. If we take a paired quantitative blood cultures of central line and peripheral line, then the central line culture should be at least 5-fold higher than the peripheral line. And the last one, DTP, that is differential time to positivity. It is the most widely accepted all over the world, and it is seen in automated blood culture systems. Here the central line blood culture bottle flags more than equal to 2 hours earlier than the peripheral line blood culture bottle. Third HAI is a hospital acquired pneumonia. It is the second most common HAI after catheter associated UTI, and mechanical ventilation is the most important factor. That's why we are mostly concerned about ventilator associated pneumonia. It is defined as pneumonia that occurs after 48 hours of endotracheal intubation or mechanical ventilation, characterized by presence of new infiltrates, signs of systemic infection, worsening oxygenation, changes in sputum characteristics, microbiological detection of infective agent. Hospital-acquired pneumonia accounts for 15 to 20% of all HAIs, and ventilator-associated pneumonia is seen in 27% of all mechanical ventilated patients. In USA, the VAP rate is around 1.43 per 1,000 mechanical ventilator days, and in India, the rate is much higher, that is around 6.74 per 1,000 mechanical ventilator days. Coming to the types of VAP, it may be early onset or late onset depending upon its occurrence. When it occurs within first 4 days of mechanical ventilation, it is called early onset VAP. And the organisms are mostly community acquired and they are sensitive to antibiotics. The organisms are pneumococcus, Rickenphalange, methicillin sensitive Staphylococcus aureus, Moraxella. And when VAP is detected after 4 days of mechanical ventilation, it is called late onset VAP. Here the pathogens are mostly opportunistic and acquired from hospital, and they are mainly caused by MDR pathogens. Depending upon the source, VAP may be either endemic VAP when the source is endogenous, and the most common cause is aspiration, or epidemic VAP when the source is exogenous, which causes outbreaks of VAP in hospitals. Diagnosis of VAP depends on 3 criteria: clinical, radiological, and microbiological criteria. In clinical criteria, the modified CPIS score more than 6 is the most popular and widely used method. In radiological criteria, the chest X-ray or CT scan shows new or progressive persistent infiltrate, consolidation, cavitation, or pneumatocysts in infants less than 1 year. And for microbiological criteria to be fulfilled, here we can see both the gram stain and culture, they have high negative predictive value of around 96% and 94% respectively. That means if we found a negative result in gram stain and culture, there is actually less likely of having ventilator associated pneumonia. And we can do culture by both semi-quantitative and quantitative methods. The threshold of different specimens are different. For ET tube aspirate, the colony count should be more than equal to 10 to the power 5. For vial fluid, it should be more than equal to 10 to the power 4. And for protective specimen brush, it should be more than equal to 10 to the power 3 colony forming unit per ml. And some studies have shown while comparing the semi-quantitative and quantitative cultures, and they have got complete concordance of both the techniques. That's why Infectious Disease Society of America recommends to use non-invasive ET aspirate with semi-quantitative culture method rather than invasive and quantitative culture. And the gold standard test is histology at autopsy. The last one is the surgical site infections. SSIs are the infections that develop at the surgical site within 30 days of surgery or within 90 days of surgeries like in breast, cardiac or joint surgeries including implants. SSIs affects 1/3 of the patient who have undergone mainly the abdominal procedures. It is the most frequent cause of unplanned readmission, and the SSI rate is 1.9% in USA, whereas in India it is much higher, that is around 4.1 to 11 per 100 surgeries. The SSI rate is less than 2% in clean wound, 3 to 11% in clean contaminated wound, more than 10% in contaminated wound, and around 20 to 40% in dirty infected wounds. The etiological agents of SSI depends on the site of procedure and the source of infection. An endogenous source, mainly the skin commensals and the GI flora are the main pathogens, and in exogenous, which is the most common, it occurs due to the contact of the healthcare personnel, and here the MDR pathogens like your MRSA, Pseudomonas, Acinetobacter are mainly encountered. Now, an important thing, every hospital must adopt hospital infection program as a part to provide safe environment both to the patients and also to the healthcare personnel. And for effective infection control practice, we need a good team in hospital infection control committee, which is headed by an administrative control, that it is headed by a chairperson who should be the medical superintendent or the director, and member secretary who is the head of the department of microbiology. And the core team or the core committee constitutes of infection control officer, who is the clinical microbiologist or ID physician. It also includes infection control nurses, lab technician, data entry operator. Other members of HICC without whose cooperation the infection control program may not be successful are the head of all clinical departments, officer in charge of nursing section, biomedical waste, OT complex, CSST, laundry, housekeeping, kitchen, etc. A little bit about the medical legal aspect of healthcare associated infection, as HAIs are a major challenge in public health systems. Both patients and the healthcare workers may raise issues sometimes. Sometimes a patient may file complaint against a hospital regarding the negligence about its infection control practices, which is common in Western countries, and it is also a concern in developing countries due to increasing awareness. So all the hospitals must have proper documentation of standard infection control practices. Similarly, the healthcare workers may acquire HAIs due to occupational exposure like any needle stick or shot or in splash. So the hospital should ensure providing immunization to all its staff, and there should be a designated nodal center where all the occupational exposures should be reported, and it should also have a provision of testing and providing PEP prophylaxis around the clock. Thank you.
So thank you, Somi, for your very elaborately you have told regarding the overview of this. Now I must welcome our second speaker, who is most eminent and knowledgeable on this topic, and that is Dr. Professor Apurva Sastry, who is working as additional professor in JIPMER Puducherry, and he is the nodal officer of Infection Control Committee in Pondicherry, as well as the antibiotic stewardship program in JIPMER Pondicherry. Now, he has passed his MD and DMD in microbiology. He has taken a special training on infection control program in Scotland. He has published 3 very, very beautiful books on microbiology, parasitology, and essential of hospital infection control. He has contributed a chapter in our national guideline of hospital infection control in formulated by Government of India, and also he has contributed a chapter in CDC guideline how we must do the environmental cleaning in healthcare facility in a research limited setting. To his credit, there are 65 national and international publications. Now he is the investigator of HHSC study in COVID ICU and doing a VAMR study relating to the MDR XDR analysis. He is a course coordinator for giving workshop or training program to HIC, and he has very important, he has developed a software how we must do the hospital infection control, and which will help in app and web-based data collection for all surveillance and audit activity of HICC. I welcome this young, dynamic, and most knowledgeable doctor to give his lecture on this prevention of healthcare associated infection. Please, Dr. Apurva Sastry, I hand over to you.
Yeah, hello, ma'am. Am I audible?
Yes, yes. You.
Yeah, hello, ma'am. I'm thankful to the organizers, Nirupama ma'am, Shomi, and all other faculty of Department of Microbiology SCB to give me this opportunity for this event. I'm also thankful to the Dean of SCB to give me the opportunity to have this session. So Somi has already set the stage ready for me because he has given a beautiful outline of the various type of HAI, the transmission risk, and the etiological agents. So she has made the platform ready for to have the discussion on the various preventive measures of HAI. So can I share my screen?
Yes, yes.
It's nice to see all department faculty together in the telemedicine hall. Usually online event, all will be operating from their respective homes. So I usually miss the offline event, the physical events, because online event hardly we interact with each other. We hardly know who are the audience, and there is no eye to eye contact at all. So I try to make the session brief and to the point so that we could finish on time. So the preventive measures of HAI can broadly be categorized into uh, standard precaution and transmission based precaution. Standard precautions are those measures which we can take regardless of any infection risk is there or not. Okay, so again I repeat the definition. These include those infection control measures which one should follow when providing the care to all individuals regardless infection is present or not, while handling all specimens regardless the specimen is infectious or not, and while handling on all sharp items regardless they are infectious or not. So we are not going to see that whether the individual is or whether the specimen or whether the sharp is associated with any infection or not. Whenever we are handling them, we have to follow a certain standard set of infection control measures which are called as the component of standard precautions. So hand hygiene, personal protective equipment, biomedical waste management, segregation rules, spillage management, blood spill management, disinfection and environmental cleaning, respiratory hygiene and cough etiquette. So these are the various components of standard precaution which we will see now. In contrast, transmission based precautions are the additional precautions what an individual has to take. So these are always called as over and above standard precautions. So don't think they are standalone. Standard precaution is always there. Over and above standard precaution, these are additional precautions which need to be followed. So that is required when you have a specific transmission risk. Like when you whenever you have you're expecting a contact or transmission risk, like the various MDROs in the hospitals, like the escape pathogen what Dr. Somi has told in her session. So those escape pathogens in the hospital, when you're handling, you have to follow contact precautions. Contact precautions, there are various components. Of course, hand hygiene is one among the component, and the two important PPEs are gloves and gown. We always teach to the healthcare workers, two G's are important for contact precaution. One is gloves, or the other one is gown. When it comes to droplet precaution, the classical example is the SARS-CoV-2. This COVID pandemic has seen enough of droplet transmissions, and whenever there is a droplet transmission risk, you have to wear 3-ply mask. So droplet transmission, the basic difference between droplet and airborne transmission, that of course we all know, less than 3 feet distance the droplet can go because they are larger in size, they are larger particle, whereas airborne particles are smaller in size. The cutoff is 5 micron. More than 5 micron are droplets and less than 5 micron are airborne. And airborne, as they are smaller in size, they can disperse in air for a longer distance. Accordingly, airborne transmission can happen beyond 1 meter distance, whereas droplet transmission usually it is confined to less than 3 feet or less than 1 meter a distance. Accordingly, you need 3-ply mask and N95 respirator respectively for droplet and airborne transmission. Airborne for droplet transmission, you also need goggles because the receptors will be present in conjunctival mucosa also. So 3-ply mask and goggles are the two important component of droplet precaution. Okay, so this is how you can classify the preventive measures. So we will start with the first important topic, hand hygiene. So anybody can unmute and can tell how many times the nurse has to perform hand hygiene in this case scenario. She has recorded the pulse of a patient, then she records in the case sheet, then goes back to the nursing station. He draws the blood for another patient, And while transporting a specimen, a drop of blood fell on her palm. Then she enters the operation theater to assist the surgery. So it is a mixture of case scenario is there here. So when the nurse will perform, when the nurse will be recording the pulse of a patient, and after measuring the pulse when she is writing on the case sheet, you have to perform 3 times hand hygiene. The first sentence itself you have to perform 3 times hand hygiene before recording the pulse, after recording the pulse, and after writing on the case sheet. So 3 times you have to perform the hand hygiene for the first sentence. Then she draws the blood for another patient. So when he's drawing the blood for another patient, again before and after drawing blood, before aseptic and after aseptic procedure, you have to perform hand hygiene. While transporting the specimen, a drop of blood fell on her palm. So this is an indication for hand wash. Earlier, whatever we have discussed, those time hand rub, if you do, it is more than enough. But when you have visible blood on your palm, you have to do hand wash, not hand rub. After that, she enters the operation theater to assist for a surgery. So when you are assisting a surgery, you have to perform something called as hand scrub. So these are the 3 different type of hand hygiene method: hand rub, hand wash, and hand scrub. Hand scrub for surgery, and hand wash when your hands are visibly contaminated with clinical specimens, and hand rub is when you're routinely doing activities in the ICU and wards. Okay, so these are the indications of hand hygiene. This is also called as my 5 movement of hand hygiene. It is a WHO proposition which clearly states that these are the 5 situations, these are the 5 opportunities where we have to perform hand hygiene. And when you are performing hand hygiene, you have to perform through the particular steps. So these are the steps of hand hygiene, and you have to particularly give importance to the step number 2 onwards, because these are the sites. You can see that web space, then back up the finger on the palm, thumb, and scrub your nails on the palm. So these are step 3, 4, 5, and 6. These are the steps which are high risk area for hand. You can see that the next picture, you can see that these red zone areas are the areas which is frequently exposed to organism. The resident flora are more commonly they occupy this space. So that is why WHO has told that these are the steps. You cannot miss any step. Very simple statement. Can I do a partial hand hygiene? Answer is no. There is nothing like called as partial hand hygiene. So you must be wondering, I am wearing mask all the time, why still I got COVID? The reason is hand hygiene is a very, very important step in COVID, and most of us, we do not tend to follow hand hygiene. Okay, so we are doing a hand hygiene study in COVID ICU. So this is a study inside the COVID ICU. We are performing hand hygiene audit. More than 100 participating centers are there. So there it is a WHO endorsed study where we are performing the hand hygiene audit inside the COVID ICU by using a app. Okay, so now the question is, what is the relationship between hand hygiene and glove use? Especially in COVID pandemic, everybody is wearing glove in the ICUs and wards, and they're thinking that once they wear glove, they are immune to COVID, so there is no need to do hand hygiene. It's a extremely wrong concept, misconception which we all have. Glove use does not substitute hand hygiene. Wherever there is an indication, we have to do the hand hygiene. Ideally what should be done is, the gloves need to be worn only when it is indicated. Glove need to be worn only when it is indicated, and after the indication is over, remove the glove and do hand hygiene. For situation such as inside the COVID ICU, where the indication to glove use is always like now the current indication is you should constantly in such situation the glove use protocol has to be you have to do hand and CDC maximum has recommended 6 times. More than 6 times you have to change the glove and do hand hygiene. And this is normally inside the COVID ICU. And you have to discard the gloves earlier to 6 times if you have a visible soiling of gloves, if the glove is damaged, or you have you exceeded more than 4 hours of continuous use, or more than 6 times when you have done hand hygiene over the gloved hand. In all this situation, you have to remove the gloves. And once you remove the gloves, whatever reason, maybe hand hygiene is an absolute indication after removal of gloves. Okay, so WHO also has stated a similar guideline that glove hand hygiene can be performed over the gloved hand in a crisis situation like COVID pandemic. Otherwise, ideal guideline is you should remove the glove and do hand hygiene. PPE again is the next important measure for standard precaution, and PPE is a part of transmission based precaution also. At times PPE is a part of standard precaution, at times PPE is a part of transmission based precaution. Like for example, when you draw blood, you have to wear gloves. When you draw blood, you have to wear gloves. It is a part of standard precaution. You don't know that the patient is HIV positive or not, but when you draw blood, you have to wear gloves. This is a part of standard precaution. However, for when you go inside the COVID ICU, you have to wear a certain set of PPE. That is a part of transmission based precaution. Okay, what PPE we have to wear inside the COVID locations? Again, it depends upon the transmission dynamics. COVID is transmitted by droplet as well as by contact. Therefore, the two contact precautions PPE are gloves and gown, and two droplet precaution PPE are goggles and 3-ply mask. 3-ply mask in general and N95 if aerosol risk. Aerosol risk is there inside the ICU, so you can wear N95. Otherwise, in ward or in other areas, you can wear a 3-ply mask. So these are the respiratory or droplet protection PPE, and these are the contact precaution PPE. So these are the PPE required when you go inside the patient care area, which is called as red zone area. Yellow zone area, that is the nursing station and the corridor, where a 3-ply mask is more than enough. And green zone, there is at present there is no concept of green zone because the general guideline inside the hospital is you have to wear 3-ply mask. So yellow and green zone are considered together. Remaining all PPE, whatever we wear, all these are called as non-essential PPE or superstitious PPE. These are considered as superstitious PPE. The more scared you are, the more number of PPE you wear. You would have seen people have worn 3-ply over N95, N95 over 3-ply, 2 pair of gloves, 2 sets of gown. All these are like higher level of scaredness. You pray God so much. So similarly, higher you are scared of COVID, you will wear all these things, and you will not be doing the bare minimum thing, that is hand hygiene. That is how you will end up in contracting COVID eventually. So eye protection is equally important. We tend to forget many COVID care locations. We have seen that people do forget to wear goggles or face shields. So you have to tell that the SARS-CoV-2 receptors are present only in 3 areas. One is your mouth mucosa and your nasal mucosa and your ocular mucosa. So these are the 3 places your receptors are there. So if somebody will ask you which is more important, gloves, gown, or goggles, answer is it is the goggles which is more important, because it will directly protect your eye mucosa from the virus. Whereas gloves and gown are the part of contact precaution. So unless you take your hand to your face, you're not going to get COVID. Your hand contamination will be there, but that from there, when you will get COVID only when you do you touch your eyes, nose, or your oral mucosa with your hand. So hand hygiene is important, of course, but equally important is eye protection. Okay, so PP audit you have to perform in your ICU. So we are doing PP audit in JIPMER. This is our donning audit form, and this is our doffing audit form. So these are the forms we use, and we do PP audit. And this is our centralized doffing audit area. So this is our HICC team. So these are the infection control nurses who are sitting there, and the healthcare worker is doffing the PPEs, and we are recording it. So you will be scared. You will be scared to work in COVID, and eventually what you have to understand is, if you maintain adequate distance, then there is no need of getting scared. And this kind of doffing audit is extremely useful, extremely helpful, because doffing under supervision is a very good protection for the healthcare workers. So this is the doffing, donning sequence, which you have to understand that this sequence is very important. Especially your goggles should be worn after the mask. The last thing to be worn is gloves, and hood has to be placed only after the goggles. So these are the few tricks what you need to remember. Unless you do the donning in the proper sequence, lot of empty spaces will be there through which the virus may enter. I will show you some wrong sequences. So you can see that according to the correct sequence, first mask, then goggles, then the hood, and of course before that you have to wear gown. So this is the sequence what you have to wear. So hood has to be worn after the goggles. So you can see one picture here. In this particular picture, hood is there inside, and outside is there goggles. So this is a wrong sequence. By this, what will happen is, when you remove it in the doffing area, when you remove it, goggles you will remove first. You're forced to remove the goggles, but actually the goggles to be removed towards the end of the doffing. So if you remove the goggles earlier, then it is a risk. Similarly, goggles are worn first, then mask. This is also a wrong sequence. You can see that because the mask is worn later, mask is outside. That creates lot of empty spaces. And again, your 3-ply mask is worn inside, N95 is worn outside. Again, it will create lot of empty spaces. Okay. First of all, our double masking is not required, and when you do the double masking, it is the N95 which should be inside, not the 3-ply mask. You can see here, by doing this, there is lot of empty spaces, and that creates a big problem. And again, when you wear 2 pair of gloves, which is not indicated, but if you are wearing 2 pair of gloves, then you should not wear just one after the other, because if you follow this sequence, then there is a big problem while you remove. Both pair of gloves will come together. So the rule is, you should wear the correct sequence is, gown sleeve should be in between the 2 pair of gloves. This is the correct sequence. Okay. So again, mask when you wear, then the upper knot is up and lower knot is down. This is the correct CDC recommended zone stripes. If you knot it crisscross, then it is not correct. Crisscrossing is not correct. Upper one should be knotted up, and lower strings should be knotted down. Fit check is very, very important. So if you do not do a fit check, again, uh, it is a non-compliance. Fit check is a process by which you will confirm that your mask is uh, completely, it has been placed properly over your face. So you can see that there are 3 steps of fit check. You'll do a sealing first. Sealing is pressing over the nose bridge. You have to press over the nose bridge as well as over the side. Then you take a deep exhalation, positive pressure. That is a deep exhalation you have to do, followed by you do a deep inhalation to make sure that there is no leakage from the side. When you exhale deeply, you have to ensure that you don't have leakage. You should feel that there is no leakage from the side. That is where you will know that your N95 respirator is worn properly. And when you wear N95, it is only and only for 8 hours, after which you have to discard it. Do not do a practice of reusing the N95, which is not required. By the way, N95 is required only inside the COVID ICU. Outside, if you wear N95, it is only to reduce your scaredness, not to reduce the infection by COVID. Okay, so these are the doffing PP sequences. So doffing is also equally important. I mean, doffing is even more important than donning, because doffing, there is a high risk of self-contamination with droplets. So here the golden rule is the contact PPE has to be removed first. That is 2G. Gloves and gown are the 2Gs. Contact PPE to be removed first, followed by droplet PP. In droplet PP also goggles first, last is mask. Last PP is mask. Others are non-essential PP, so I am not focusing on not essential PP. You don't focus on the non-essential PP, just essential PP, among which the contact PP has to be removed first, followed by droplet PP. So this is the thing what you have to understand. And mask need to be removed outside the doffing area, and following which you have to wear a fresh 3-ply mask. Do not remove the mask inside the doffing zone. It has to be removed always and always outside the doffing area. So there are some breaches during the doffing, which I will tell you. The second globe, you have to put your finger inside the second globe and remove. This is the correct method. And in this particular picture, she has removed the second pair of globe by touching by the outside. So this is a wrong practice. Then again, the gown removal, there are some wrong practices. Like, so the correct practice is you have to touch the inside of the gown and roll into a bundle. So this is the correct method. Incorrect method is touching the outer surface of the gown, not rolling to the bundle and directly throwing into the bin. So all these are wrong practices. Then goggle removal also wrong practices. Like, you have to please remember that mask and goggles, when you are removing, your eyes should always be closed. Close your eyes when you remove your mask and goggles. So not closing eyes is again a non-compliance, and not bending forward is also a non-compliance. Mask removal, there are so many breaches what we see. You have to remove the mask outside the doffing area, not inside the doffing area, which is a wrong practice. Overhead removal also is a wrong practice. Not bending forward also is wrong practice. Again, one more thing is upper strip has to be removed first. Lower strip you have to remove first, and then the upper strip. If you remove the upper strip first, then the mask will hang on your body. So this is also a wrong practice. Removing upper elastic is a very common wrong practice. Okay, so these are the, and touching the outer surface of the mask, again, not closing eyes, not doing hand wash after removing mask. All these are wrong practices. And for the general people, the most important wrong practice of mask is they think that if the mask is there on your body, you are protected from COVID. Regardless, it is there on your nose or your neck or wherever you keep, you hold the mask in the hand and you can roll around and you think that you are protected from COVID. Hanging mask syndrome is one of the worst situation because of which many of you would have acquired COVID also. And hanging mask, the reason why you get COVID because of the hanging mask is when you wear the mask, your neck area is exposed to COVID. So when you lower down your mask, your inside mask is contaminated with COVID, and when you reposition again, your the COVID virus will be directly in it. So this is again extremely tricky situation. We all know this, but still we are tempted, because what is easy to do, we always attempt to do. What is difficult to do, in spite knowing that there is a direct risk if you do hanging mask, but everyone, including the politicians, ICMR staff, whoever, I mean, COVID infection control or COVID policy decision making individuals, everyone does hanging mask syndrome, in spite they know that it is a high risk. So that is the situation we have. So this is all about hand hygiene and PP. Other areas of standard precautions maybe we can discuss sometime later, because there are various components of infection control practices. But I thought I will confine the session to two important areas, hand hygiene and PP, because these two are the burning areas. So ma'am, Nirupama ma'am, so this is all about. So if anything is there, any questions are there, then I'm more than happy to address.
Thank you very much, Apurva. Right now we'll see the chat box and there are some questions. You please go through that so that we can finish that. So this is from, please read some. So,
This one.
So can you please share your experience on how you implement antimicrobial policy in your hospital?
Dr. Trupti Swami,
From
Dr.
Trupti Swami.
Trupti Swami.
This itself is a session, Somi. So antibiotic.
So this is a question from Dr. Trupti Swami in the chat box.
Yeah. So
Yes.
Dr. Trupti, this itself is a session where antibiotic.
Yeah, no, because you are in charge of the antimicrobial stewardship program. That's why I thought I would say, I mean, your experience would be very much helpful to our hospital. Just
Yes.
if you can share a few lines.
So there are various components of antibiotic stewardship. One of the component is diagnostic stewardship. So I would like to focus more. Are you a microbiologist?
I'm a pharmacologist.
Pharmacologist. Okay, then I will tell you the pharmacology component of antibiotic stewardship. So there is something called as TDM, or the therapeutic drug monitoring. So this is one component of AMSP, where the drug concentration, the antibiotic concentration, especially vancomycin, aminoglycosides, and colistin. So these three are the important drugs which need to be monitored, so that the drug concentration will be adequately maintained in the patient. So this is one aspect. Otherwise, in general, antibiotic stewardship has got three components. It has got a diagnostic stewardship component, it has got a clinical stewardship, it has got an infection control stewardship.
Yes.
Diagnostic stewardship is something which the microbiologists should implement. They should make sure that the turnaround time of the culture investigation should be as less as possible. So I can say that in my lab, I am in charge of diagnostic blood culture. So once the blood culture bottle flags positive, within 10 hours the report goes, which we call as preliminary report, where we give the direct susceptibility test result to the clinicians. That goes within 10 hours of the bottle gets flagged, and 18 hour more we give the Vitek report. So for us the turnaround time is roughly 24 to or 28 hours where we give the final report. So by doing this, what is happening is we keep the clinicians frequently informed. We have to do a stage wise reporting. We have to report the gram stain result to the clinician. Then we have to report the direct preliminary susceptibility report, following which the final report goes. So stage wise, if you keep the clinician informed, then that is immense help for them to model.
Yes, yes, very true, very true. Excellent.
There are
Very
many
informative session, yeah.
maybe sometime later in a bigger forum I will try to
Yeah,
address.
So
we'll be happy to have you.
Thank you, Dr. Trupti. Right now, I will go to the second question, which has been asked by Professor Indu Sankar. How can we prevent fogging while wearing mask?
Of glasses. Glasses.
Suppose somebody is wearing spectacles and wearing mask, how can we prevent fogging in the
Okay.
spectacles?
Okay, understood. That is called as anti-fog glasses are available. So anti-fog glasses are available. These are quite expensive, but those glasses will prevent fogging. Second thing is one of the common problem what happens is there is a space which gets created in when you wear the goggles. That space should not be there. If space is there, then definitely that the space will air will go through the space. A easy solution what we found in Jipmer is there is a 3-ply mask comes attached with face shield. I have focused that in one of my slide. Face shield attached with a 3-ply mask. That particular face shield we have found that the fogging is very less. So wearing the goggles technique need to be improved. Point number one, and face shield attached to 3-ply mask is another method by which the fogging can be reduced. And of course, the best method is anti-fog face shields or anti-fog goggles. They are quite expensive, but you can buy once for all, and you can reuse. Unlike mask, which cannot be reused, goggles and face shield we can decontaminate with alcohol, and then we can reuse.
The third question is,
So how to differentiate between pneumonia originating from commensals and from exogenous source?
Point number one, you should have more number of pus cells. Pneumonia originating from commensals. Okay, yeah. So see, the pneumonia cannot be, or I'm not getting commensals means endogenous source, right?
Yes, sir, yes, sir.
So that is endogenous source. The organisms are quite common organisms, like hospital acquired organisms. If the patient is hospitalized for longer duration, then the hospital acquired organisms, the escape pathogens, will be colonizing the oral cavity first, and then from the oral cavity it will trickle down to the lungs. So maybe a oral flora examination also will have a reconfirmation that what is grown in tracheal aspirate, the same organism is grown in the oral cavity cultures also. So this is one way we can confirm. Otherwise, environmental sampling we can do to say that it is exogenously the same organisms are there in the ICU environment.
so the next question is,
So what is the common organism involved in secondary infected pneumonia following COVID?
Plenty of hospital acquired infections, Acinato, Pseudomonas, E. coli, Klebsiella, the same HAI bugs which are there. Otherwise, those are also, I mean, those are even more commonly spread in COVID ICUs, because of the simple reason is the healthcare workers do not do hand hygiene. They do not do hand hygiene. They wear gloves, and they continuously go from one patient to other patient. So HAI spread very fast inside the COVID ICU. In JIPMER, the common organisms are Acinetto, Klebsiella E. coli, Pseudomonas staph aureus, Enterococcus faecium, VRE, especially vancomycin resistant Enterococcus. Pre-COVID, post-COVID, there is a big jump from around 10% pre-COVID to 30-35% post-COVID. So this is the situation here.
The second question asked by Dr. Sanatan Behra is,
So after being discharged from COVID, if again the patient is admitted with pneumonia, what is the most common organism isolated?
That depends upon the situation where the patient is from. If it is a community patient, then the community pathogens. If it is a hospitalized patient, then various HAI agents. I mean that is extremely a variable answer here. It depends upon the place to place.
Next question is from Dr. Kritika. So she's asking that you have said N95 is recommended in COVID ward only and ICU. So what you recommend for healthcare workers like us who are in hospital environment, whether N95 or 3-ply mask will be enough?
3-ply mask is more than enough. I have shown you my doffing area picture also. We have a centralized doffing area where HICC nurses, the infection control nurses of JIPMER, they stay there 8 to 10 hours in the duty time. We have a round the clock shift duty there. So one ICN stays there for 8 to 10 hours, and she wears only a 3-ply mask and goggles or face shield. So eye protection plus nose protection, more than enough. More than enough. Only thing is we should not touch our eyes. We should do hand hygiene if we accidentally touch anything. Otherwise, wearing N95 in a normal situation, no non-patient care areas inside the hospital is compromising your respiration.
next.
So another question from Dr. Sonam. So can we sterilize the N95 mask using UV?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. That is what you wear N95 and then you find that it is expensive, and then you try to see how to reduce the cost. N95, once you wash it, it will become a cloth mask. Many of the healthcare workers I have seen their N95 is crumpled. Why it is crumpled? Because they would have washed yesterday and they would have worn again today. Then it will become a cloth mask. Sterilization. This particular question is about sterilizing N95 mask.
Using UV, sir.
Using UV.
No, UV sterilization is not recommended. The recommendation method is only acceptable recommendation method as of now is plasma sterilization or hydrogen peroxide exposure. And plasma sterilization, if you do one N95 mask for plasma sterilization, will cost around 50 rupees. So if you buy a N95, also is almost same price. So that is why in JIPMER we have not adopted the policy of plasma sterilization of N95.
So our last question is from Dr. Shrikanta Patra. What to do if one gets accidentally exposed while doffing?
Yeah, so very nice question, Dr. Shrikant. Accidentally exposed while doffing. Here we have to quantitate what is the degree of exposure, and we have to qualitate what is the type of exposure. So first is we have to qualitate what is the type of exposure, whether it is a mask exposure or it is a breach in mask or breach in goggles, breach in gloves or breach in gown. And then we have to then once you qualitatively see where is the breach, the second question you have to ask is what is, I mean, how much extent the breach has occurred, or it is called as quantitation of exposure. So both the things are important to take the necessary steps. If it is clear that there is a droplet breach, that is mask, like you have not worn mask and you have gone inside the ICU, or while you remove the mask, you have touched your eyes, So those kind of quantitatively, it is clear cut exposure. Then there is a policy that you I mean, it also depends upon hospital policy. In Japan, we have a policy that we have to quarantine the healthcare worker for a particular period of days. Then he will be tested for the virus, and after that he's free to work. But we usually don't get, because we have a direct supervision doffing exposure. So ours, even is a slightest breach also we don't get, because always ICN is there to supervise.
The session, and now it is over to our dean and principal to end the session. After that, the Thanksgiving ceremony is of mine. So I'm requesting dean to have a last talk.
Thank you, Professor Chaini. It is indeed very, very informative, even though we have discussed the basic thing. It is a very important thing that every healthcare worker to be aware about. In fact, while I was listening, I heard about the CAUTI. It is a day-to-day activity that we do, putting a catheter in a man where there is an indication. We come across a lot of cases where there are CAUTI. Now, the other one aspect, CRBSI, whatever has been mentioned, the general experience is that, most of the time, if it is a long term, more than 30 days, then obviously coronary growth is almost nearly 100%. But our experience is that people keep on catheter for months to years. Now that is one area, but having a symptomatic UTI is not that common unless there is comorbidity. But that is a risk factor, no doubt about it. But what is much more important that we should keep in mind to avert a continued castration, we have got intermittent castration, self-clean intermittent castration, those people who require long-term castration. There should be some study. In fact, we had conducted a study. There should be also some study regarding the, significant bacteriuria following an intermittent castration. That is one area I think our institutions should take up. I request Professor Chaini to look into that. People having intermittent castration, we should try to know what is the rate at which the colonies grows, whether it is significant bacteriuria or not non-significant bacteriuria, and finally whether there is a documented symptomatic UTI in this patient. Now these are about the CAUTI and CRBSI, whatever we say. And as regard whatever question has been told, in fact at the introductions I had mentioned that, risking a healthcare worker, we are all vulnerable and exposed. So risking a healthcare worker, whatever has been told by Dr. Apurva, I think it is of paramount importance. A precaution can save us from disaster. And thank you, Dr. Apurva. It was a wonderful talk. It is very basic, very useful, and one must follow it very strictly. This is a very good session we had, and I'm really thankful to all. I hand over to our moderator for the formal vote of thanks. Thanks all.
So now we have come to the end of the session. I must be very much thankful to Dr. Apurva, who has already told us about the basic things in our day-to-day practice, and definitely this will help us in our day-to-day work and all. So thank you very much, Apurva. Now next, thanks to Dr. Swarhota, our Dean and Principal, who has given us opportunity to have this pre-platinum CME, and that is very informative. And thanks to all the faculties and Professor HODs of different departments and postgraduate students who are listening to this session. And I am very hopeful that This will help them in their work. Our next, but lastly, I must be very much thankful to the staffs of telemedicine who had spent 1 hour with us in this holiday. So thank you very much. Thanks a lot. So let's leave the meeting. Thank you.
Now it is my turn. The last thank has to go from me.
Okay, sir. Thank you very
Yeah.
much. Okay.
In fact, thank you, Professor Chaini. Had you not done the seminar on the mucormycosis, we could not have conceptualized that we should go for a pre-platinum jubilee CM. Thank you for that. And thank you for taking all the initiative. On behalf of the institution, I really personally thank you for your involvement. Thank you.
Thanks. Let's leave the meeting.